Good morning. For those of you I've not had the chance to meet, my name is John Highbush, and I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. In honor of our men and women in uniform who protect our freedom around the world, if you please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we begin this morning, I'd like to recognize some special guests I know that are with us, and I'll start with our Ventura County Supervisor, Peter Foy. Peter? The Mayor of Simi Valley, Bob Huber. Bob, thanks for coming. The Mayor Pro Tem of Simi Valley, Barbara Williamson. Barbara. And the Simi Valley City Manager, Mike Siddell. Mike. From the day this hilltop was chosen by President Reagan as the home for his future presidential library, the Reagan Foundation and Library has been represented in Congress by Elton Gallegly, a veteran of Capitol Hill who will be retiring this year and who's done a terrific job representing our mission. Today, we are joined by a man who I am sure will be his successor, Congressman Buck McKeon, who, as a result of the congressional redistricting process, will soon represent the Reagan Library as part of the 25th Congressional District he so ably has served for almost 20 years. Now, Congressman McKeon is no stranger to this part of California, and he is by no means a stranger in the halls of Congress. As the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee in the 112th Congress and the committee's ranking Republican before that, he wields the gavel of one of the most powerful and prestigious committees in Washington. His committee is charged with safeguarding our country's national security and equipping our fighting men and women as they dedicated their lives to ensuring our freedom. I had the opportunity to work as a staff member on Capitol Hill during the Reagan administration and spent the better part of my 8 years there focused on helping to win passage for much of the defense buildup proposed by President Reagan, a buildup that helped lead to the fall of the Soviet Union and the ending of the Cold War. I well remember President Reagan's quote at the time. "Here's my strategy on the Cold War," he said. "We win, they lose." I know enough of Chairman McKeon's stellar record in his support of our military to say that when it comes to America's enemies today, whether it involve threatening nation states or terrorist operatives, he feels the same way. He's here today to address the strategies necessary to maintain a fighting force in a world every bit as complicated and dangerous as that faced by President Reagan. And we are delighted he has chosen the Reagan Library as the place to do it. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Congressman Buck McKeon.
Thank you very much, John, for that warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this beautiful facility. Reagan and his people really knew how to do things right. The setting, the beauty of this whole structure is phenomenal. And you just can't help but think about President Reagan while you're here. And it's timely, given the political season, that one of the most famous campaign ads in history was President Reagan's Bear in the Woods ad. During the race, the Reagan campaign was having trouble explaining their peace through strength foreign policy to the American people. The electorate at the time seemed to prefer Walter Mondale's simple, deferential approach to the Soviet Union. So the campaign team did what Reagan was best at. They simplified the message, as John just so aptly put. In the ad, there was an ominous reference to the Soviet Union, as a narrator gravely warned, "There's a bear in the woods." The point was that unpredictability was a dangerous enemy is a threat that must be taken seriously. Today's world is ripe with unpredictability, and America's 21st century strategic outlook is a tangled mess. A senior military leader recently told me, "In my 37 years of service, I've never seen a time as dangerous as today." We live in a globalized economy where all venues of commerce and communication are networked. Violence or conflict in a remote region of the world can ripple across borders, faiths, and economies. I'm concerned about a world where the flap of a butterfly's wings can create a tornado. That means we must make preparedness a top national security priority. The price of liberty, Thomas Jefferson once wrote, is eternal vigilance. Dwight Eisenhower echoed that sentiment. Everyone knows his remark about the military-industrial complex. Let me tell you another thing that he was famous for. He was the soldier that hated war. I quote what he said about peace. "The vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be ready, must be mighty, prepared for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk its own destruction." Two broad oceans once protected what Reagan called the shining city on a hill. Today, our economy draws its strength from critical geographical choke points. One of those, the Middle East, is undergoing an historic shift. Iran's quest for nuclear weapons is perhaps the gravest threat to the global order we have seen since the collapse of communism. As populism realigns the Muslim world, the lines between sects of Islam are sharpening. Sunnis and Shias have fought for centuries. Now Iran, the world's most prolific exporter of terrorism, wants to throw nuclear weapons into that mix. People often ask, would Iran dare to use nuclear weapons? I ask you, can we afford to believe they won't? Can we afford to believe that China, which just this month announced a 12% increase in military spending, will allow our Pacific allies to live in peace? Reagan mastered the art of keeping this nation out of hostilities. But today, we tend to forget we are a nation at war. Though the mission is in a far-off land and among an unfamiliar culture, we also forget the sacrifices of a generation, our new greatest generation, that have kept us safe since the September 11th attacks. Californians have led the way in our defense, both at home and in the field. Duncan Hunter, the son of former chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, joined the Marines right after 9/11. Leaving his wife and children at home, he served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then took his seat, his father's seat in Congress, and now sits on the House Armed Services Committee with me. Men like California Assemblyman Jeff Gorell, a Navy officer who just returned home safely from Camp Leatherneck, Afghanistan. We are lucky as Californians and as Americans to have these men and women who have taken the time and are defending our freedom and representing our values. Their story has been repeated over and over. Citizen soldiers who have given up time with their families and their careers to deploy into harm's way. It's tragic that their story can be subdued when a lone individual commits horrible acts. This past weekend, it appears we lost a soldier to his demons and it cost many Afghan civilians their lives. People that we have tried desperately to help recover from 3 decades of conflict. When you look at the war through that terrible, violent act, it seems hopeless and lost. I know that the American people are heartsick over what has become of the Afghanistan mission. I share their fear that we may be adrift, and I'm certain that we are suffering from a lack of commitment at the highest levels. But the reason we liberated Afghanistan in 2001 was right then, and it is the same reason we fight today to keep it liberated. And we overlook the fact that for every one chaotic event that loops endlessly in the media, there are infinite tales of heroism and courage, selflessness and integrity that are never reported. President Bush gave over 40 speeches about the war on terrorism and the importance of victory, updating the American people. President Obama has given 3. We must do a better job of communicating the importance of this fight. We must do a better job highlighting the stories of courage and daring of our military and what they've etched into the stone of history. Our troops have earned that honor, and our troops deserve that honor. Our principles have not changed. We reject those who would kill women and children to serve political ends. We reject those who use violence to intimidate free people into submission and compliance. And we reject those who would convert Afghanistan back to a launching pad for terror. We reject them, and when it is necessary and in our national interest, we must meet them with force. Now, there are risks, and results take time. But asking if Afghanistan is a winnable fight is the wrong question. What we should be asking ourselves is if we still believe that the greatest force on earth is American resolve. We should ask if we believe in imposing limitations on ourselves. An insurgent is the toughest kind of opponent a democracy can fight. Rooting them out takes patience. Over the past 18 months, we've knocked the Taliban on their backsides. We demonstrated that, like in Iraq, the right strategy and ample force levels can bleed the toughest insurgency dry. So we must be extremely cautious when we discuss pulling surge forces out before we have secured our gains. We can still leave Afghanistan with our heads held high and the Taliban defeated, but it will take resolve and patience. As President Reagan demonstrated, Americans excel at both. Now, it's worth mentioning that aside from conducting oversight of the war, one of my chief responsibilities as chairman of the House Armed Services Committee is building the defense budget. For fiscal year 2013, the budget we received from the President was really concerning. The budget cuts $43 billion from a wartime military. It cut 23 ships from the Navy's fleet. Many senior flag officers have testified that the fleet is already too small to fulfill its operational requirements. It cuts 150 planes from the Air Force, despite the urgent need for tactical airlift in places like Afghanistan. And it cuts a whopping 80,000 soldiers from the Army, 20,000 Marines. Instead of coming home to ticket tapes, these brave men and women will come home to pink slips. Instead of marching in victory parades, they will stand in unemployment lines. That is shameful. These cuts are real, and we will all start feeling them soon. They will affect every American base, installation, and military unit in the world in some way, shape, or form. And they won't just hurt our national security. These cuts, deeply damaging to our defense, will hurt everyone associated with the military. The families from Camp Pendleton that have endured extended deployments for the past decade. The teachers who educate children of deployed heroes. The civilian workers who do maintenance at Edwards Air Force Base. The tailors off base who mend sailors' uniforms at Point Mugu. And the assembly line worker who turns wrenches on airplanes in Palmdale. Our national defense, the most sacred and righteous responsibility of the federal government, is larger than just those who wear the uniform. But when we cut the services and support that keeps our military potent, we hurt ourselves in ways beyond national security. Let's not forget that when we must take up the fight against freedom's enemies, it is Congress's job to make sure it's not a fair fight. The cuts that I outlined take us right to the limit of acceptable risk. Because the Congressional Supercommittee failed to reach an agreement on mandatory spending, a sequestration mechanism will kick in next January 1st. Sequestration takes all the cuts that I outlined and doubles them. It pushes us far past the limit of acceptable risk and would put this great country in great danger. The Joint Chiefs had months to prepare for the tough reductions in the Budget Control Act, but sequestration does not afford them that luxury. The cuts are blind. That means that the Defense Department will have to go line by line through everything in the budget and take off 8 or 12%, depending on what they do about personnel, from each line item. As one admiral testified in our committee, how do you cut 12% of a ship? If sequestration passes unscathed, we will begin the process of cutting approximately $100 billion a year from the military for the next decade. The cuts will force another 100,000 troops out of the Army and the Marines. We'll shrink our Navy to its smallest size since World War I, and the Air Force will be its smallest in history. We will not modernize our nuclear deterrent, which hasn't seen replacement systems in decades and is the smallest since the early 1950s. Active duty military, reservists, federal civilians, and contractors will be laid off. Some assembly lines and shipyards will close. We estimate that around 1.5 million people will lose their jobs as a result of the defense cuts in sequestration. We will go through not one, but 2 rounds of base closures. Southern and Central California could be particularly hard hit. The economic areas around military bases, the ones that survive, will experience a decrease in business. We should all be alert and aware of what could happen to the military our parents and grandparents built, and the armed forces that Reagan refined. President Eisenhower said that a people that values its privileges over its principles is doomed to lose both. We should ask ourselves, will this be the moment right now when America abandoned its special role in the world and transformed itself from a superpower to a regional power? Is this the point where Americans put their privileges and entitlements ahead of their principles? In the latest budget, the administration increased spending in nearly every government department while the military absorbed massive cuts. They do this knowing that our debt is sinking this nation and sinking it fast. And they think that if they toss the military overboard, they might be able to stay afloat. That's a bunch of baloney. If you cut the entire Defense Department, we would still be running huge deficits. That's how much our entitlement programs cost, and that's how expensive these programs have become. They now threaten our first and most sacred entitlement, the right to safety, life, and liberty. Despite this gloomy strategic outlook, I'm not so pessimistic. I believe we can first protect and then restore our armed forces. I will not be a partner to the management of this great nation's decline. I will not be complicit in the dismantling of the Reagan military. My priorities as chairman for the coming budget are straightforward. I have a three-pillared philosophy towards revitalizing our military forces. They are: first, resolve sequestration; second, reverse these massive defense cuts; and finally, restore and rebuild America's military. The first step in staving off the dire sequestration scenario is buying us some time to move past the election, where we can look at this in a reasonable way. I've introduced a bill that would pay down the first year of sequestration by naturally shrinking the federal workforce. That workforce has grown exponentially since 2009. While the president proposes laying off more than 120,000 troops, he has hired 120,000 new federal bureaucrats. This bill does not fire federal workers, but decreases their ranks naturally. If one person quits or retires, two others must quit or retire before an agency can hire another worker. This was actually a bipartisan solution that came from the president's own debt commission. It pays for the most damaging year of sequestration next year and moves the budget debate into calmer waters. While this is a simple, acceptable solution to a tough problem, I'm open to any compromise or any plan that pays down sequestration in a responsible manner without crippling Americans with tax hikes during this fragile recovery. From there, it's my concern that my sincere hope that Congress can work in a bipartisan manner on a year-by-year basis, thus reining in spending without gutting our national defense. The second pillar is reversing the first tranche of defense cuts that we enacted as part of the Budget Control Act last summer. Now, I voted for the BCA. I did so because we were facing a government default that would have, among other things, cut off salary payments to our troops. As chairman, I could not let our military go without pay. I held my nose and voted for the BCA with the hopes that we could fix the serious problems with the bill shortly thereafter. That's why one of my top priorities is getting that $500 billion back. The taxpayers rightly demanded that everything should be on the table for deficit reductions. I agree. If we can't find savings in a $500 billion budget, shame on us. But explain to me why defense is less than 20% of the federal budget, but has accounted for half of the spending cuts to date. Taxpayers said, cut the fat out of defense. We did that. We're past cutting the fat and past the muscle, and now we're cutting into the bone. And the consequences are being felt. Look no further than the historic strategic shift we were forced to adopt this year as the president gave a speech. As many of you know, the administration's force reductions mean we can no longer sustain the strategy that has kept America safe for decades, because we will no longer have the forces to stay strong in critical regions. The administration announced a new focus on the Pacific Rim. I'm also working hard to ensure that the pivot to Asia is not an empty one. Now the administration calls it a strategic pivot. I call it a head fake. A pivot implies that you have some body weight behind the movement. Though the administration says we're shifting to Asia, they're actually reducing the number of ships and planes we have available to respond to crises anywhere. We will do our utmost to ensure this strategic shift is viable and does not place our troops at unnecessary risk. There's no disagreement that it's a vital region. We should be worried about China when they just announced another double-digit increase in their defense spending. We spend about half of our base defense budget on personnel, investing in their health care, education, living allowances for our troops. China buys things that shoot, and they can buy far more of them for their dollar than we can. So we must do our utmost to reverse the defense cuts enshrined in the Budget Control Act, to help ensure the pivot to Asia is not a hollow one. That means reinvesting in modernization for our Air Force and our Navy. We will seek to modernize airlift, including C-130s and C-5s that predate the Reagan administration. We will try to hold back the cuts to the Navy's cruiser force, finding the money for our cruisers to undergo proper upgrades instead of mothballing ships needed to sustain the shift to Asia before those ships reach the end of their lifespan. We will hold the administration accountable on the promises they made to modernize our aging nuclear deterrent in exchange for ratification of the START Treaty. We must also allocate resources for contingencies like Iran. We'll be looking to place emphasis on vital weapons should the Iranians determine that a peaceful nuclear-free existence is not in their best interest. Our defense bill this year will reflect appropriate resourcing for things like powerful bunker buster munitions, countermeasures for mines, and appropriate sensor and intelligence platforms. We will continue to focus heavily on countering anti-access systems like Iran and China would use to deny free transit to the international community. My obligation as chairman is to ensure that if the president uses the military option against Iran, that option is a credible one. Because what happens in to the world's economies if we can't ship strategic resources out of the Persian Gulf? What happens if we can't stop Iran from closing the Strait of Hormuz? There are too many trouble spots in too many regions for us to abandon the two-conflict strategy. Because the first round of cuts forced us to abandon the two-war defense, undoing the military reductions in the Budget Control Act would allow us to return to that proven strategy. The third and final pillar is to restore a military chewed up from 10 years of fighting. This is the longest war we've had in our history. When we increased defense spending during the Bush years, we spent money on things like body armor, UAVs, and armored vehicles. What we did not do was upgrade replacement systems that were canceled during the Clinton years. Today's military is by and large a smaller version of the Reagan military. Most of the planes, ships, and tanks were built during his administration. We must end this unofficial procurement holiday and get our forces the tools they need to win the current war and deter future wars. That means repairing and replacing equipment that was lost and damaged in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. It means upgrading and restoring our nuclear deterrent, which is falling apart after 2 decades of neglect. And most importantly, it means we take care of our people. In last year's defense bill, we acknowledged that modest increases in certain areas of military health care were appropriate. Those fees were both reasonable and small. But recent proposals to pump up military health care by up to 300% is absolutely unacceptable. When our troops made a decision to volunteer for service, they entered a sacred agreement with this government. Part of that agreement was that their medical needs would be met. We made a solemn covenant with them. We must not break it. Because to maintain a strong America, we need our all-volunteer military. Are we ready as a nation and a people to embrace the concept of helplessness on the world stage? Are we prepared to accept the possibility that someone other than us can shape our destiny? We will do what we can on the committee and with this defense bill, but it's not going to be easy. To put it plainly, we need your help. We need your help in restoring the concept of the Reagan military. Just the name invokes the concept of strength and certitude. I need you to be advocates for the principles that President Reagan advocated. I need you to stand with our troops. I need you to reject intervention, government intrusion in our lives, and refocus this great republic back to constitutional obligations for the common defense. These cuts can be stopped, averted, held off, but it requires you, each of you, to be involved, to be vocal, to be strong. How can we call ourselves Reagan Republicans if we sit quietly during the most systematic and catastrophic cuts to an institution that Reagan helped build? Remember the triumphs of the Reagan military. The Cold War, the great threat of our time, ended without a single shot being fired. The Gulf War, where we decimated the world's fourth largest army in less than a month. Remember Reagan's three-legged stool, the compass that keeps us focused on our conservative principles. When we are strong and when we stick to those principles, America does wonderful things. We cannot walk blindly through this defining period in our nation's history. We cannot ignore the lessons of the past. I believe in optimism. I believe in confidence. And I believe that with your support, we can stage a resurrection of this great country. We've taken our licks, and this past decade has been a tough one. But we've endured a revolution, a civil war, a Great Depression, 2 world wars, and a Cold War. Every time we take one on the jaw, we climb back up off the mat. My job, our job, as Californians and as Americans, is to stiffen that resolve. The ability to control our own destiny is what makes us Americans. The power to guide our destiny is what makes us great. And our determination to protect that destiny is what makes us free. Together, let's determine to be masters, not victims of our fate. Thank you. God bless our armed forces. God bless the great state of California, and God bless America.